Kapla! Last week, I introduced you to some common argument errors that we call fallacies. Now, as you know, this is a self-defense course. It helps you to defend yourself from being fooled by bad arguments. Fallacies are bad arguments that tend to persuade, or you could say bad arguments that look like good arguments. There are lots of different fallacies, and it's possible to spend an entire three-credit course on fallacies. And in fact, some of the things that I've already talked about in the course are sometimes treated as fallacies. So, for instance, a few weeks ago, we talked about analogical reasoning or argument by analogy. Well, when it's not a very good argument by analogy, and to be honest, most arguments by analogy are not very good. A not very good argument by analogy is sometimes referred to as the fallacy of false analogy. Also, some of the problems that can happen with induction and statistical arguments, for example, cherry picking, which we discussed a few weeks back, is sometimes called a fallacy, and sometimes people stick it in the chapter on fallacies. Also, basing an inductive generalization, another thing that can go wrong with inductive reasoning. Basing an inductive generalization on a single example or a very small number of examples is sometimes called the fallacy of hasty generalization. I've chosen to organize this part of the course the way I have, focusing on things like forms of inference, because I think it's more useful to you to be able to figure out what makes arguments strong or weak rather than just look for problems. I don't want to make you assume either that all arguments have fallacies, that criticizing an argument is a sort of Easter egg hunt of trying to find fallacies, nor that just because an argument contains no fallacies, that means it must be a good argument. As usual, things are more complicated than that. Knowing about fallacies and how to diagnose them is a good thing to have in your critical thinking toolkit, especially since some of them are common tricks that dishonest people will use to fool you. But but that's exactly what I want you to have, a critical thinking toolkit, which means a bunch of different tools suited for different problems and situations. You can't fix a clogged drain with a hammer, right? Everyone knows that. No, hammers are for doing philosophy. There are two broad categories of fallacies that we're going to look at tonight that are called formal fallacies and fallacies of diversion or fallacies of distraction. Formal fallacies are not fallacies dressed up in a suit and tie. Unfortunately, they are fallacies where the problem has to do with the form or structure of the argument, the way the different parts of the argument fit together. Distraction or diversion fallacies function by diverting the argument off onto a tangent or side issue, or sometimes they derail the discussion altogether. All right, on with the fallacies. Consider the following example. The United States is the richest country in the world. Therefore, Americans must be very rich people. What is the form of inference used here? Is it inductive? Is it deductive? Well, the fact that America is the richest country in the world is something that we learn through observation. So does this mean that the reasoning in the argument is inductive? A few weeks ago, I said that inductive generalization is when we infer about a class or group of things by observing one or more members of that group and generalizing. But here, the premise, hang on, but here the premise says the United States is the richest country in the world. There isn't any evidence given about individual Americans, so there isn't any evidence given to make an inductive generalization from. It is, in fact, a bit like a change in the unit of analysis, like we talked about in the lecture on statistics. So, does that mean that the argument is deductive? It feels deductive. It feels a bit like math. And remember, I said deductive reasoning is like math, but with words. Somebody might say that if a country is rich, then the people in it are rich. That's just common sense. But a valid deductive argument needs at least two premises. So there would have to be a second premise here, like an implied premise, you know, like with an enthymeme. What would that premise be? Anybody? Well, imagine that somebody making this inference is applying a rule. This rule might be if a country is rich, then its citizens are also rich. Something like that. Or possibly they're applying a more general rule. What is true of the whole must also be true of the parts. But whichever version we go with, there's a problem. And that problem is the premise in either version is false. Consider the first one. If a country is rich, its citizens must also be rich. Well, income inequality, as I'm sure you're aware, is a serious problem here in Canada and in the US. I don't know if you hear this, but I hear all the time that people are having trouble affording their rent or being able to buy groceries. Home ownership is at an all-time low. You'd be surprised to learn that the United States has a high poverty rate compared to other rich countries. I did a little Googling and I found some numbers. These are all countries in Europe. None of them are as rich as the US, but they are considered to be rich countries. And as you can see, the poverty rates are pretty small. 3.1% for the Netherlands, that's the highest one. Sweden, 1.7%. Denmark, 0.8%. Norway, 0.7%. And Finland, the lowest one that I could find, 0.3%. 0.3%. Who's even heard of Finland? Did you know that there's a conspiracy theory that Finland doesn't exist? You can look that up. Given this data, does anybody want to guess what the poverty rate in the US is? You know it's going to be higher than these numbers because of, well, narrative reasons. So maybe it's 5%, 6%? Well, it is, in fact, 11.6%. That's more than three times the highest one on this list, the Netherlands, and 30 times as much as Finland. Finland! I suspect some of you are curious. The poverty rate in Canada is 10.2%. Now, you have to take these numbers with a grain of salt because different places may define poverty rates or the poverty level in different ways. And I didn't actually spend a lot of time verifying my sources, but even if these numbers are only approximately correct, it is clear that the US, despite being the richest country in the world, absolutely does not have the richest citizens in the world, at least not the majority of them, not the average, not the greater part of the citizens. Now, it's always fun to shit on the US, but I probably didn't really have to convince you that just because a country taken as a whole is wealthy, that doesn't mean that all or even most of its citizens are wealthy. Income's not evenly distributed. We already know that. But but there's a more general point to be made here, which has to do with the relationship between the parts of a thing and the thing that's made up of all of those parts put together. The the parts versus the whole. Speaking of wholes, there's been some construction going on in my neighborhood for a annoyingly long time, and outside my house is a large pile of gravel. Gravel, in case you're unfamiliar with this word, gravel means small rocks. There is outside my house a large pile of small rocks. The whole is big, but the parts are small. Similarly, this transformer here is purple, but none of the pixels on your screen that make up the image of it are purple. Pixels are red and green and blue. There is no such thing as a purple pixel. Groups of pixels can be used to create any color because the properties of the parts that make something up can be, and quite often are, different from the properties of the whole. So whenever you're tempted to make a judgment about the parts of something based on the whole, or the other way around, just remember the big pile of small rocks. When you assume that the properties of the whole always or necessarily are also the properties of the parts, it's called the fallacy of division, because you have a whole and you're dividing it up into different parts and assuming that the parts are like the whole. Going in the other direction, assuming that what's true of the parts of something must also be true of the whole, is called the fallacy of composition. Now, before we go on to the other fallacies, I want to go through an example of one of these fallacies, composition and or division. Here is the example. We're going to read it, and then we're going to go through the steps for criticizing a fallacy that I showed you last week. Christianity, as a religion, is all about charity and forgiveness. Christians must therefore be charitable and forgiving people. Here are the steps. The first step is to write down the main conclusion of the argument. You can write down the conclusion and the premises if you want. You might find it easier to do it that way, or it might make you more confident that you have it correct. But for the purposes of the homework and the fallacy test, you just have to write down the main conclusion. So, who can tell me what the main conclusion is here? Well, let's look at it again. Christianity as a religion is all about charity and forgiveness. Christians must therefore be charitable and forgiving people. Now, you might not have noticed, but I gave you a teeny tiny hint there. That hint was the word therefore, which, as you know, is one of the indicator words for recognizing conclusions, which leads us to believe that the conclusion of the argument is Christians are charitable and forgiving people. Main conclusion, Christians are charitable and forgiving people. Don't look at the other parts. Step 2, the name of the fallacy committed. Well, you already know that it's either the fallacy of composition or the fallacy of division. What are the criteria for the fallacies of composition and division? The fallacy of division is when you assume that what is true of the whole must also be true of the parts. And the fallacy of composition is when you assume that what is true of the parts must also be true of the whole. Which one do you think applies here? Well, the conclusion, Christians must be charitable and forgiving people, the conclusion is about the parts. So the inference is about the parts. If the conclusion is about the parts, then probably we're moving from the whole to the parts, which would make it the fallacy of division. Does that make sense? Let's try it and see if it works. What is the whole being referenced in this example? Yes, Christianity. And what is the parts, or what are the parts? Christians. Exactly. So the conclusion is about Christians. The premise is about Christianity. So we're moving from the whole to the parts, which is the fallacy of division. So I've written that down here. I've also written down the definition, assuming what is true of the whole is also true of the parts. All that's left is to explain how the argument commits the fallacy, which we do by connecting the text of the argument to the criteria for the fallacy. So we want to connect the criteria for the fallacy of division, which is assuming what is true of the whole is also true of the parts. We want to connect that with the text of the argument, which is about Christians and Christianity. So what I wrote was, in this case, the whole is the Christian religion and the parts are the individual believers. So as you can see, what I did there is I identified the whole and the parts because the definition of the fallacy has to do with the whole and the parts. And in the explanation, you're supposed to be showing how the argument commits to fallacy by connecting the criteria to the text of the argument. That's not quite good enough, however, because you also need to show why the fallacy is wrong, why the fallacy is a bad way to argue in this case. So I wrote, Christian doctrine may emphasize charity and forgiveness, but individual believers vary in their interpretation of the doctrines and their faithfulness to them. Okay, so as you can see, I'm still talking about it in terms of the whole and the parts, following on the first sentence, pointing out something which is common knowledge that individual believers vary in their interpretation of the doctrine and their faithfulness to them. We don't have to supply any evidence because it is common knowledge that not everyone who adheres to a particular religion takes it as seriously as others. And just to be thorough, I added, we cannot assume that what is true of Christianity is true of each and every Christian. So does that make sense? Do you understand how that is an example of how to explain the fallacy by connecting the definition of the fallacy to the text of the argument? Yes? Do you think you could do that on a test? I think you can. Let's move on. The fallacies of composition and division resemble a number of other what we could call formal fallacies, which are fallacies that use fallacious deductive reasoning. Yes, fallacious. I'm going to have to ask you to not be salacious about the word fallacious. Remember when we talked about deductive arguments, and I said that whether a deductive argument is valid meaning whether the conclusion follows from the premises, has to do with its structure or form, well, formal fallacies happen when the argument does not have a valid argument pattern, so the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. But it might look like it follows. Consider, some Republicans are members of the NRA. Some members of the NRA are members of the KKK. Therefore, some Republicans are members of the KKK. Okay, so some explanations may be in order. NRA stands for National Rifle Association. It's a powerful group in the US that lobbies against gun control legislation. If it weren't for the NRA, there probably wouldn't be a mass shooting every other week in the US. That may have sounded flippant, but it's also true. What are Republicans? Well, I believe I talked about them last week in the lecture segment on conspiracy theories. They're the conservative political party in the US. Among other things, they make it impossible for the government to pass sensible gun legislation. As for the KKK, you've probably heard of them. It stands for Ku Klux Klan, often referred to just as the Klan, but with a K instead of a C. There's probably a reason for the name, but I didn't bother to look it up. I just assumed that you would be familiar with it. Basically, the KKK is a white supremacist terror organization that arose in response to the abolition of slavery in the United States. They do things like murder black people, try to keep them from voting, and other really bad stuff. General education. Anyway, both of these premises are true. Most Republicans are members of the NRA. They're very pro-gun. And probably most KKK members are also members of the NRA. I say probably because the KKK is a terrorist group, so its members normally keep their identity a secret. Okay, if both of these claims are true, can we infer that some Republicans are members of the KKK? Can we? I can hear you hesitating. Perhaps it would be helpful to compare this argument to a known valid argument pattern. Here it is on the screen. All A's are B's, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are B's. On the other side, I have filled in the terms from the example. So here we fill in for A, Republicans, and for B, NRA members. So we have all Republicans are NRA members. And we fill in for C, KKK members. So the section premise says all NRA members are KKK members. And the conclusion says all Republicans are KKK members. So you can see how the argument in the example resembles this pattern, which is a valid pattern. So does that mean that the conclusion follows from the premises? Well, probably not, because you know I'm explaining a fallacy. There's a difference between this valid argument pattern and the argument that we were given on the previous slide here, which is here it says some Republicans are members of the NRA, not all Republicans. And some members of the NRA are members of the KKK, not all of them. So if only some Republicans are members of the NRA, does that mean that some of those Republican NRA members are also the NRA members who are part of the KKK? Well, no. Or more precisely, We don't know. The information that we're given doesn't allow us to infer that. Some Republicans are members of the NRA, so that means that some NRA members are Republicans. Some NRA members are also members of the KKK. Does that mean that the Republican members of the NRA are members of the KKK? We don't know. We don't know because the premise says some NRA members are Republicans, but it doesn't specify which NRA members. If it helps, I've made a diagram. Imagine that the red circle contains all Republicans, that is, members of the Republican Party, and the green circle contains everybody who is in the NRA. The blue circle contains everybody who is a member of the KKK. So the first premise tells us that some Republicans are also in the NRA. So there's an overlap between the two circles, the red circle and the green circle, right? Some Republicans are members of the NRA, so this group overlaps with this group. That's what the diagram tells us. These are called the Venn diagrams, by the way. I bet some of you already knew that. We also know that the NRA overlaps with the KKK because the second premise tells us this, which is why the green circle containing NRA members overlaps with the blue circle containing KKK members. But we don't know if any of the Republicans who are members of the NRA are also members of the KKK. So we cannot draw the Republican circle overlapping with the KKK circle. That's why I've drawn it the way I have. Does that make sense? Well, hopefully between the verbal explanation and the diagram, you got the idea. The error committed in this argument is called the fallacy of the undistributed middle, which is a bit of a mouthful. So I'm going to abbreviate it FUM or FUM. Why is it called the fallacy of the undistributed middle? Well, here is Mr. Spock from Star Trek to explain it for you.
Serving on board a starship sure provides ample opportunity for real space exploration.
I'm interested in rogue planets. They're exceedingly rare, especially ones with an atmosphere.
It's amazing, isn't it, that we've come across a rogue planet drifting through the sector.
Yeah, and did you hear? There are animals living on that rogue planet.
Really? I know there's a survey team running scans on the surface, but I hadn't heard that.
Well, they detected there's life down there, and some life forms are animals.
Huh? I guess that makes sense.
I know. Imagine that. Animals on a rogue planet.
How amazing.
Excuse me, crewman, I couldn't help overhearing.
Yes, sir?
The argument you are employing, Mr. Walking Bear, is not logical. In fact, it exhibits the formal fallacy of the undistributed middle, a syllogistic fallacy.
The argument seems to make sense.
That may seem so, Lieutenant, but the form of the argument is invalid.
The undistributed middle is a formal fallacy that is committed when the middle term in a categorical syllogism is not distributed in either the minor premise or the major premise. According to the rules of logic, a term is distributed when a sentence says something about everything the term designates. In the argument, all horses have 4 legs, and all dogs have 4 legs. Therefore, all horses are dogs. Both horses and dogs are 4-legged, but no statement was made about the whole class of 4-legged beings. Mr. Walking Bear, you made the same error when you stated that since life was detected on the planet, that life was animal life. Your argument went thus: there are life forms on the planet. Some life forms are animals. Therefore, the life on the planet is animal life. That is incorrect reasoning.
Thank you, Mr. Spock.
Of course. I should rethink what I'm trying to say. That would be best. Even if an argument seems to make sense, it cannot be valid unless the form is valid, and that it does not exhibit one of the logical fallacies, such as the formal fallacy of the undistributed middle. It's only logical.
It's okay if you didn't understand Mr. Spock's explanation. I recognize it was a bit abstruse. It did, however, remind me that we have seen the fallacy of undistributed middle before. Remember this? All dogs are mammals, all cats are mammals, therefore, all dogs are cats. This is an example that I used back when I introduced you to deductive arguments. It was an example of a deductive argument that is not valid. We can see why it's not valid, which means that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises if we just analyze it. The first premise connects the term dogs with the term mammals. All dogs are mammals. The second premise connects the term cats with the term mammals. All cats are mammals. But there isn't a premise that connects the concept of dogs with cats. Dogs are mammals and cats are mammals. This means that dogs and cats have one thing in common, being mammals. But just because they have that one thing in common doesn't follow that they're going to have other things in common, nor does it follow that they are the same thing. This is how guilt by association works. You've probably seen examples of guilt by association. You say you're a vegetarian? Well, guess what? Hitler was also a vegetarian, so that means you're probably a Nazi. Here's another one. Oh, you're a communist? Well, Stalin was a communist, and he created a famine that killed millions of people, so you must support genocide. The first one of these examples is obviously ridiculous, but it uses exactly the same logic, exactly the same argument structure as the second one, and the second one is the sort of thing that people actually say. You might not see this exact wording, but you will see something similar to it, where somebody points to atrocities committed in the name of communism, or at least by people who said that they were communists, to imply that any version of communism or anybody that claims to be a communist is just as bad. There's an expression, tarred by the same brush. You might have heard that. I think of this as the all dogs are cats fallacy. I think of the sentence, all dogs are cats, which reminds me of the argument on the previous slide. All dogs are mammals, all cats are mammals, therefore all dogs are cats, which reminds me of the argument form here, which reminds me of how the fallacy works. So if you just remember all dogs are cats, I think you'll be fine. There is, however, a different problem, which is not the fallacy of the undistributed middle, but which looks like it. So I wanted to talk about it here. It's not technically the fallacy of the undistributed middle, but I couldn't find a name for it. So if you called it that on an assignment, I wouldn't mark it wrong. Like I said once before, it's more important that you understand what is wrong with a fallacy and be able to explain to someone how it's a bad way to argue than it is for you to get the technical name correct. So imagine that you're having a conversation with someone. I'm imagining a specific one of my colleagues right now, but it doesn't matter for the purposes of the example. You're having a conversation and it comes up that you're in favor of legalizing prostitution. And then the other person looks kind of mortified and says, don't you know that the United Nations has declared human trafficking to be a global human rights crisis. I assume you know what prostitution is, but can somebody tell me the definition of the term human trafficking? How about you, the person in the Spider-Man costume hanging upside down from the ceiling? Human trafficking is when adults or children are transported, usually against their will, usually across borders, for the purpose of exploiting their labor. Sometimes they're kidnapped or coerced, sometimes they're tricked. Usually, once they're there, they're prevented from leaving in some way and forced to do some sort of exploitative work for their captors, which can be prostitution or sweatshop labor or other things. The concept of human trafficking has become associated with prostitution and other forms of sex work. So when people hear the term human trafficking, they usually think sex work, even though trafficking for forced labor, like in factories or farm work, is far more common. We even have a word for it, sex trafficking. And this is where the problem starts. The word sex trafficking is sometimes treated as interchangeable with human trafficking. So when you hear a statistic like 24.9 million people are trafficked worldwide, people think that those 24 million people are working in the sex industry, but actually, most of them are farm laborers. So, because the concept of sex work has become associated with the term human trafficking, people think that what is true of human trafficking is also true of sex work. Do you see how that's similar to the fallacy of the undistributed middle? We could make it fit the form of undistributed middle if we wanted to. Try this. First premise, some sex workers are trafficked. Second premise, human trafficking is a major human rights crisis. Therefore, sex work is a major human rights crisis. This is basically the same argument form as the Republicans and KKK argument that I talked about earlier. So although we can make it fit the pattern of the fallacy of undistributed middle if we wanted to, it's often not phrased in this form. The previous example, oh, you're in favor of legalized prostitution. Didn't you know that the United Nations declared human trafficking major human rights crisis? That didn't have this form. The speaker just sort of assumed that prostitution and human trafficking were synonymous. But it works by exploiting the same sort of hack in your brain as thumb does. When two things become associated, we tend to attach the associations of the one with the other, especially the bad associations. And we often do that even when the association between the two things is indirect, when they're both associated with a third thing. Then it's the fallacy of undistributed middle. Here's another example. Defending an anti-gay rights bill, Russian President Vladimir Putin once said, quote, "The Russian people do not approve of homosexuality and pedophilia," unquote. Do you see what he did there? He was being questioned on the topic of homosexuality, but he paired that concept with pedophilia, implying that they're either the same or should be thought of in the same way. Everyone agrees that pedophilia is really bad. So if someone can get people to associate gayness with pedophilia, even a little bit, it can have the effect of biasing you against gay people. Putin didn't say all gay people are pedophiles. He didn't even say some gay people are pedophiles. He did something more sneaky. American conservatives use the same trick. For years now, whenever they refer to their political opponents, the Democrats, they will say radical left Democrats. Now, logically, this shouldn't work. If we have the term radical left Democrats, that implies that most Democrats or normal Democrats are not radical left, right? Otherwise, why would we use the word? It's a bit like how we say male prostitute, because we're assuming that prostitutes are normally women. But that's not what people like Donald Trump mean when they say radical left Democrats. They pair the words radical left with Democrats in order to force an association between those terms. In reality, not only are most Democrats not on the radical left, they're not even on the left. By our standards, Canadian standards, they're a center-right party. However, like I said in the lecture on conspiracy theories, for a long time now, the strategy of the American right has been to propagate an alternate version of reality through insinuation and outright lying. And this trick works. It's sort of like Pavlov's dog. Do you know about Pavlov's dog? Pavlov was a psychologist, and he trained a dog to associate food with the ringing of a bell. Like he would ring a bell every time he was going to feed the dog, he rang a bell. So what happened was, after a while, the dog would salivate every time he heard the bell, or so the story goes. So what the Republicans are trying to do is to get you to associate radical left with Democrats simply by saying them next to each other all the time, in the way that Pavlov got his dog to associate a bell with food. So like I said before, this sort of slippage from one concept to another, from human trafficking to prostitution, or from homosexuality to pedophilia, doesn't always take the form of the fallacy of the undistributed middle. What's the middle term in radical left Democrats? There's only one term, and that's kind of the problem. This example is less of a formal fallacy and more like a kind of insinuation. Rather than claiming that Democrats are radical left or that gay people are pedophiles, they just associate the terms through the use of language. This happens to fit the criteria for a different fallacy that we're going to cover in the second half of this lecture, called prejudicial language. And we'll say more about that later. Right now, who wants to watch Star Trek? So at the time I was writing this particular lecture, I randomly felt like watching Star Trek The Next Generation, and the episode that I ended up watching randomly, like I said, happened to contain an example of the next fallacy that I wanted to talk about, which is called the fallacy of affirming the consequent. So I thought, what the hey? So I cut together some clips of the episode that will allow you to follow the story and also to illustrate the fallacy. It's only about 5 minutes long, so let's watch it now. Engage.
Very disturbing overtones in the idea of a Klingon providing information to the Romulans. Are you aware of any other Klingon-Romulan connection that Starfleet might have encountered recently?
Okay, so even if you've never watched Star Trek, you're probably familiar with it as a show that is set in the future, but is about the things that concern us today, using aliens and spaceships and such as metaphors or analogies to real-world issues. So here in this episode, when Captain Picard mentions the something he calls the seventh guarantee, the real life thing that he's talking about is the Fifth Amendment to the US Constitution, which, well, you heard what he said. It gives a witness the right to refuse to answer a question on the basis that it might be used to incriminate them. So in the following scene, Worf is all, we know he's guilty because he lied about his Romulan grandfather. And you've probably seen a similar kind of thing if you watch lawyer dramas. I have put Worf's reasoning in the form of a syllogism here on the slide. If crewman Tarses were guilty, then he would lie. Crewman Tarses lied. Therefore, crewman Tarses is guilty. That's basically what he was thinking, right? Well, if Mr. Worf was thinking this, then he committed a common fallacy called affirming the consequent. Affirming the consequent, like the fallacy of the undistributed middle, is a formal fallacy because although it resembles a valid argument pattern, it is in fact invalid. I will remind you that in logic, the term invalid means the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. So here is the form of the fallacy here on the slide. I've put it next to the argument that we're imputing to Mr. Wood. A is Truman Tarses is guilty, and B is he lied. If Tarses were guilty, A, then he would lie, B. He lied, which is B, so the conclusion is he must be guilty, which is A. Do you get it? Affirming the consequent is a common error because it looks very much like a familiar argument pattern, which is called modus ponens. You may remember it from the chapter on deductive arguments. Although not many people have heard the name modus ponens, which is Latin for some phrase I can't be bothered to look up right now, everyone has employed this argument pattern informally from time to time. If I don't have my wallet, then I must have left it home. If the cat is meowing at me, then she must want something. If I don't eat breakfast, then I will regret it later. If one thing is true, then another thing is true. That one thing, I don't have my wallet, is true. Therefore, the other thing, I left at home, is also true. That's modus ponens. It's practically the most basic example of reasoning there is. Affirming the consequent has almost the same pattern as modus ponens. The difference is that the second premise, instead of telling us that A is true, tells us that B is true. So affirming the consequent, which is a fallacy, is kind of like modus ponens in reverse. Now, some forms of logical relationships are reversible, but the if-then relationship is not. If an animal is a cat, then it's also a mammal. The reverse of that would be if an animal is a mammal, then it's also a cat. See? The if-then relationship is not reversible. Think about it. The first premise, if A, then B, tells us what is true when A is true. If A is true, then something else is also true. And that something else is, it is B. Yes. If A is true, then B is true. The premise tells us what is also true if A is true. However, this premise, if A then B, doesn't say anything about what happens if B is true. Example, if someone stole my flash drive, then I wouldn't be able to find it. This is a true premise. But if we added to this premise a second premise, someone stole my flash drive, the conclusion that would follow would be what? Well, no conclusion would follow, because we don't have a premise that tells us what happens if B is true. The piece of information, B is true, is useless to us because it doesn't work with the premise if A, then B. And I know this because I lose flash drives all the time, but I'm pretty sure that they're not being stolen. Likewise, to bring it back to the Star Trek example, there are plenty of reasons why someone might lie about something, even in a courtroom. Them being guilty of the crime they're accused of is just one of them. Crewman Tarses lied on his Starfleet application because he was afraid if he didn't lie, he wouldn't get in. That happened years ago. It has nothing to do with the spy on the Enterprise right now. But it is very common for people to engage in thinking like, oh, he pled the fifth, that means he must be guilty. Or he ran from the police, that means he must be guilty. That one's pretty common too. And we know from lots of movies that innocent people run from the police all the time. They run from the police because they have to solve the crime themselves because they're the main character. Trope. And considering what's going on in the US in real life right now, could we blame someone for running from the cops? Especially if they're, let's say, Black? Because what makes affirming the consequent a fallacy is just the fact that it has an invalid argument pattern. When you're doing the criticizing a fallacy steps for an argument that you think contains the fallacy of affirming the consequent, for step 4, where you explain how the argument commits the fallacy, all you have to do is put the argument into the form, into the argument pattern for affirming the consequent that you see here. Wait. The pattern for affirming the consequent that you see here. You don't have to also do a paragraph style explanation like I did for the example that committed the fallacy of division. All you have to do is to make it fit the pattern. If A, then B, B, therefore A. But you have to be confident that the argument really does fit that pattern. It's not enough to be able to make the argument fit the pattern of affirming the consequent. You have to be confident that this is the logic that was used in the text. And that is all that I have to say about formal fallacies. So we're going to move on to fallacies of diversion, starting with the most basic version of diversion, red herring.
The Transformers will return after these messages.